Hello everyone and welcome to a very special edition with Radio Monash. I'm Georgie McColm, your host, and I'm really excited today to welcome today's guest, Maxwell Scott, who joins Radio Monash all the way from the good old United States of America. Max is a globally recognized leader and is responsible for artificial intelligence. He's also the current co-founder and CTO of StratAlliance Global and was the senior program manager at Microsoft Office's head of responsible AI, where he guided global teams to develop and deploy AI public policy goals. He also co-chaired the UNESCO's AI Business Council and helped shape international norms on emerging tech at forums like the EU, ASEAN, and also the G20's conference. Before Microsoft and StratAlliance, Max has had a long-standing career with the US Embassy and Department of Foreign Affairs, where he was one of the first leaders in AI policy from 2016 to 2021. Right now, Max is in Australia on a 2-week visit supported by the US Embassy, speaking in Melbourne, Sydney, Perth, and Canberra. He will be speaking next at the Indo-Pacific Robotics and Automation Conference in Perth, where he'll be talking about the AI in high-risk scenarios, innovation in the Global South, and the importance of global collaboration. So, Max, thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for joining us. I've hoped I've given you a decent introduction, but feel free to elaborate.
No, thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here and really excited to talk about these topics.
So, I kind of want to get into your background first off and talking about how did you get involved in AI? Because, you studied at the University of Arizona with political science in politics, I believe,
That's right, yeah.
and also a Bachelor of Arts in International and Sustainable Relations. So how did you end up getting into AI?
I'd always been interested in policy, and my first job out of college was at a small consulting firm, and we had contracts with Microsoft doing change management and working on a lot of Azure cloud global solutions. And while I was there, I started to see that there's a really interesting nexus between policy and technology, and that as technology is developing, it's going to increasingly change and impact our societies in increasingly novel ways. And so I decided to focus on that as a challenge area. And I spent the rest of my career building on that narrative and finding ways to engage and gain technical expertise. And that led me to AI. And I became one of the first early adopters to really stress its importance and to focus on it within the US government.
How did you find that transition as a learning period from having your more international relations background and then being exposed to all of this really technical information? How did you go with that transition?
Well, interestingly, if you think about international affairs or political science, there are concepts like human rights and there are concepts like international law. When you start to get into them, you start to realize they can become quite technical and quite complex. And AI is no different. And I think, because it involves a lot of development, it involves a lot of actual mathematical and algorithmic knowledge, I think that sort of pushes people away. But at the end of the day, we're talking about societal change, and we're talking about some of the things that are going to shape the future. And that's whether that's technology or whether that's human rights. These are areas where if you lean into it and you take a growth mindset like I always have, you can learn them quite quickly.
That's great because, I've even with the implementation of AI in education in the workforce these days, it is still quite complicated, even though it is, at least with ChatGPT, quite front-facing.
Yep.
During your time at the US Department of Foreign Affairs, as you were the AI and Digital Economic Policy Officer, when did you notice that first major shift towards AI and that awareness?
Yeah, I think it's almost like there's a pre-Chat GPT time and then there's a post-Chat GPT time. And when I was focusing on AI in the pre-Chat GPT days, it was not an area of, let's say, national importance. It was a technical domain, and it was a domain of a lot of excitement, like the way we think about quantum or these other sort of emerging technologies that are still in their infancy. But then when ChatGPT happened, people immediately grasped the societal implications, and it quickly became a national priority. And that was really the moment where I saw, okay, now we've sort of reached the mainstream. But I knew early on that that's kind of where we were going with AI, because it has this, unlike other technologies, it has this universal applicability across so many different domains that its ability to shape the future is quite significant.
Well, I watched one of your previous interviews, I think you did with at Australian Space TV, if I'm getting that right, about 2 weeks ago. And you were talking about when you started in 2016, you're only really like a team 1 of 6, I believe.
Yeah.
And your team rapidly expanded. Would you say that's a reflection of just how important AI policy has become, or at least in a government role?
Exactly. Yeah, it's totally a reflection. When I first joined the team, our team was called, I think it was International Communications and Telecommunications Policy. And then when I left, we were called the Bureau of Digital and Cyberspace Policy. And it's sort of, I think it speaks to the transition we've made as we think about technology policy in relation to national priorities, where before it was really about telecommunications and the internet. Now we're talking about all of cyberspace and all of digital interaction. And I was very fortunate to be there at a time where I got to see that growth and to focus in on an area that became one of the more important aspects of the growth that occurred within government.
One thing I'd like to focus on in that area, because during, I believe you spent about 9 months to a year in Prague, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but what would you say was the key difference during that time period in 2016 compared to when you ended up leaving the US Department of Foreign Affairs when it came to AI policy?
The key difference between the U.S. and the Czech views?
Well, not necessarily. Like we could approach it from an international landscape, but I think just in general, in terms of the policy differences that you were facing back then in Prague, where there was international facing cybersecurity issues, I'd imagine, and then returning back to the US and then finishing up later in the department. What was that key difference in that time period?
Yeah. So I was very fortunate when I was in the U.S. government. I got to see I was there for the last 3 presidential administrations. So I was there under the Biden administration, I was there under the Obama administration, and I was there under the first Trump administration. And when I was in Prague, the main focus was on 5G network security, because a lot of infrastructure around the world was changing from 4G to 5G. There were Chinese companies who were making those investments, and the U.S. is very concerned about those investments. And we really wanted to compete with China on 5G network security. It was the big issue. And that was a major focus of my work in Prague, was on 5G network security. Now, leaving Prague, coming back to the US, this ChatGPT moment occurs. The 5G network security conversation that we've been having around the world has sort of moved into the background. And now the conversation about the US competition, or the AI race, if you will, between the US and China, is now more focused on AI and who's going to shape the future of this AI technology. And that was an interesting transition to make at state, and then to see, coming back into the private sector after that, to see the way that US companies like Microsoft and Google and Meta and OpenAI are thinking about these challenges on a global scale and fitting into that narrative of the US geopolitical competition with China on AI.
Well, I think that's a great transitionary point, because you are an expert in the Indo-Pacific region. And as you said, the new AI race, compared to the US, Europe and China, which are all leading the way with AI policy, what do you think will happen to other Indo-Pacific nations who don't necessarily keep up with these policy changes that the major 3 players are doing?
I think the important way to think about AI is we need to think about the stories we're telling ourselves about this technology, and what are kind of the dominant metaphors. It's not actually the killer robot or some of these other science fiction contexts that are out there. The dominant metaphor, it really is this concept of an AI race right now, if you think about geopolitics. And that's the AI race between the US and China, and then Europe's in there as well. And the problem I have with the concept of an AI race is, in a race you have winners and losers. Also, in a race, there's a discrete finish line, so you know when you've won. But in the way AI is development is diffuse, it's embedded in daily life, it's incremental. There's no real finish line to this. It's just going to keep going. And, some people debate like whether there's this concept of artificial general intelligence and whether that's the finish line. That's neither here nor there. The point is, this is incremental development in this technology. There's not going to be really a winner or a loser in AI. There's not going to be the US is going to win, or China's going to win, or Europe's going to win. But I do think there is risk of countries being left behind. And that's the thing that really keeps me up at night. And it's the reason why I focus my efforts now at StratAlliance Global in thinking about how we can bring the global south and vulnerable communities into the development of AI, to make sure these technologies are developed to empower everyone, not just the US, not just China, everyone. And that's really what the benefit of and the promise of AI is, I think, is is in being able to develop technologies that can empower all of our communities. And in the Indo-Pacific, I think this is incredibly important because the Indo-Pacific has layered histories. There are hundreds of languages. There are diverse cultures. It's not a monolith. And if you're thinking about AI development and you're deploying, let's say, a solution that's been created in California, if you bring it out to Cambodia, it's not going to work the same way just because these are different places. And so I think if you think about the AI race and you think about where AI is headed, there is an opportunity for the Indo-Pacific to lead and to engage on these issues. And I think if you, in relation to responsible AI, the opportunity is inclusive innovation and engaging with local communities and finding ways to build AI systems that reflect the best of us and reflect the communities around us. And that's the thing that I'm really excited about on AI innovation in particular, is the innovation that's going to happen in the Global South, the innovation that's going to happen in the Indo-Pacific, both in places like Australia, but also in ASEAN, and the Indo-Pacific, and the innovation that's going to happen in our most vulnerable communities as it relates to AI.
Well, speaking of, how do you actually go about creating sustainable and ethical AIs in countries that don't have English as their first language? So how would you approach or guide a nation that hasn't necessarily started to develop its own AI policy so that it reflects their own cultural values while providing as much assistance as the AI can?
Yeah, so there's sort of two parts to that question, I would say. You're right in identifying that most of the large language models that currently exist are trained on English data. There's nothing to say that large language models can't be trained on other languages. In fact, we've seen companies like Korea Telecoms and other initiatives that are happening in the UAE and other countries where they are building large language models that are focused on specifically on other languages. And as they are thinking about how they test those models for safety, they have mapped out cultural concerns that you wouldn't find in California. There are cultural concerns that are very specific to those regions. And so we are seeing large language models being built in other languages, and that's a very interesting and promising development that's happening if we think about inclusion in responsible AI. Now, the other piece that you touched on is cultural context. And there's a bunch of different aspects we can take with that. One is obviously different cultures have different ideas in how they think about harms and values and what's important. But also there's a whole span of mixed digital literacy where some people don't understand how this stuff works, or they don't even understand what AI is in some places. And that's totally understandable because there are places where access to these technologies is seldom found. But you can always distill these problems down to first principles. You can understand challenges and opportunities and people's anxieties if you relate it to their daily lives. And you ask questions like, who is in power? Who makes the decisions as it relates to these models? And you ask questions like, how do you feel about the information? How does it make you feel if something is more creative than you? There are ways to kind of distill these concepts down into cultural touchstones that people can relate to and then build governance around that. And my company has actually designed and developed, working with an anthropologist in Berkeley, a series of workshops that we do where we engage mixed literacy communities on very simple concepts that relate to AI and help them to understand and articulate the challenges and opportunities that they're excited about and most afraid of. And by getting that information out there, you can then build a system that is encoded and testable based on those concerns. And you can tie it to the cultural touch points and the cultural harms of a specific context. And my hope is that as we think about developing and deploying AI, we are going to make time to engage those communities so that we can build systems that are inclusive of those specific harms that only occur in very specific contexts where these systems are being deployed.
What would you say is the biggest challenge in that? Would you say it's the communication difference? Would you say it's the lack of awareness and understanding of AI? But when you approach these challenges that you've been given at StratAlliance, what is the massive hurdle that you need to overcome?
Well, I think there's a couple of big challenges. First, I would say it's very difficult for people who are not technically versed in AI to feel comfortable talking about AI because it feels like it's this big amorphous concept and it's very technical. They don't understand how it works. They don't want to sound silly because their only kind of relation to it is science fiction. so getting people to say like, hey, it's okay to admit what you don't know. It's okay to admit what you don't know. That's a big challenge. And then the second piece is, in order to have a meaningful conversation with a mixed digital literacy audience, you have to be able to translate really complex topics into things that they can understand if they have no familiarity with this. And this is what I was talking about earlier, where you need to think about, are you going to ask them, well, how do you feel about data protection and this model? You know what I mean?
That's like, what?
Some people don't understand data protection, and that's perfectly okay. My grandma doesn't understand data protection, but I can talk to my grandma about, like, how would you feel if someone learned a secret about you that they weren't supposed to learn?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So you can take these concepts and you can distill them into universally applicable ways of communicating about that, to where you can make reasonable inferences about how an AI system is going to affect a community. And that's the way we approach these challenges.
Would you say that you've learned these science communication skills along the way, or was that something that you had to develop over time?
I definitely learned these along the way.
Yeah.
And I learned them because when I was a diplomat, I really focused on the Indo-Pacific. I spent a lot of time going to the Indo-Pacific and focusing on the whole range of digital policy that the US was interested in. And it was a huge learning opportunity for me to just see how brilliant some of these people are in the Indo-Pacific, and really working under incredible constraints that you wouldn't find in some environments like Myanmar or Cambodia or Laos, to innovate and to really make a difference in their communities. And that's inspired me to this day, and it's really led me to kind of focus on this work.
And I'd like to just quickly return back to the AI race, so to speak.
Okay.
What would you say is the difference in approach between the US and China, for example, with how they approach their own AI policy and strategy? Would you say one is more ahead in terms of policy-making decisions, or more on the technical side of things? What would you say the key differences between these two nations in how they approach and implement AI?
The Chinese approach to AI innovation is really steeped in Chinese socialist values. And there is a lot of government sponsorship and even government ownership in developing and deploying Chinese AI models. And there is a level of government involvement in the creation and deployment of AI systems that you won't find in the US within China. In the US, there is almost the opposite approach, where the government is much less involved directly in the development and deployment of these systems. There is significant private sector investment, and we do not have a national AI law. We have an executive order that has helped guide federal agencies and sort of shape a direction. We have an AI law in Colorado, and we have an AI law in California, and there are other state initiatives as well. But we don't have a national AI law, and that makes it difficult if you think about, like, who is going to lead AI from a policy perspective, because you need to have a model to point to say, this is how you do AI policy. And right now, the best model is actually what's happening in Europe with the EU AI Act. That was actually a really innovative and in many ways thoughtful approach that they spent years and years building. And I was involved in the negotiations of that law from the State Department side. It's not perfect, but
it's a start.
But it's something.
It's something.
I mean, we don't have that in the US.
Would you say that that's actually detrimental going forward? Like, do you see more complications arising from that because there's no law or policy in place in the United States currently?
From a leadership perspective, it's very difficult to lead if you're not leading from the front by showing how you want to, specifically how you're going to implement responsible AI. And I think in the US, it's very difficult for us to exercise and showcase the leadership without a national law. And that's actually not a new phenomenon, because it was a similar conversation when the US was engaging on debates on privacy and data protection, for example. There's no national privacy or data protection law in the US either. Instead, we rely on a patchwork of state-level regulations, and we ultimately ended up following Europe's lead with their general data protection regulation, GDPR. So it's entirely possible that the future of AI regulation is going to be determined in the same way as it was with privacy regulation by this European law.
What do you think it will take for the US to start implementing some of these policies and start putting it into law like in the EU? Like, what do you think will finally be that motivating factor that gets that ball rolling?
In the US, it's very challenging because we have obviously a federal system where our states have a lot of power.
Yes.
And they have a lot of autonomy within their own jurisdictions. So, and that's partially why it was difficult to create a national privacy law. And that's why it's also difficult to create a national AI law. However, I think, the US leads on innovation frontier models. It leads on investment in the private sector. Many of these models are being built out of California, and a lot of that innovation and a lot of those labs are based in the US. So we have all of the ingredients to have leadership, global leadership on responsible AI and global leadership on AI in general. I think it will just take a dedicated amount of focus and prioritization on these issues and finding a way to bring together the perspectives in the US to take that patchwork of context that we have in such a diverse innovation ecosystem and turn it into a law that's universally applicable across from the United States. But going back to this concept of inclusive innovation, the US and how diverse and dynamic it actually is, if we were to be able to build a national AI law, then we would have an AI law that reflects our own diversity and could be useful globally in creating a model of what inclusive AI looks like.
And moving on a bit more to AI safety and national security, but could you actually explain what AI looks like in a national security context? Because I think, as you've said earlier, the Terminators, sci-fi movies, that's kind of what it's thought of. But what would you say is AI in national security?
Yeah, so there are a lot of deployments that are happening in national security right now. And I think what AI is really good at is helping us to make faster decisions. And it's helping us to take, environments where making incredibly fast decisions are quite common in the national security context, where you need to decide like whether an engagement makes sense or whether it doesn't make sense. And AI is really good at taking incredible amounts of data and simplifying it. So what we're seeing in these national security contexts is a lot of this decision-making software that's helping commanders and people who are involved in making national security decisions make more informed decisions faster. We're also seeing a lot of prominent AI technologies like facial recognition or biometrics increasingly used in these environments because these are environments where security is incredibly important. And then, things like facial recognition or image recognition are quite useful because you can identify, for example, like whether someone might be holding a weapon if it's hidden behind a piece of clothing, or whether someone might identify themselves based on as an enemy combatant based on the type of clothing that they're wearing or the specific symbolism that might be on their clothing. So these are technologies we're seeing used in national security contexts, and as I'm sure you can imagine, there's a whole range of harms you can foresee that could occur if these technologies were to fail or to be misused in that context. And that's why responsible AI, why it's considered one of the highest risk contexts, and why responsible AI in that context is incredibly important.
Yeah, because that opens up a whole can of worms when it comes to, okay, well, how is that implemented? What are the regulations around it? Because the other important thing too is AI still in its infancy. What are the fact-checking methods that, we all hear as students and in a university setting in particular, you can't always rely on ChatGPT to give you the most accurate information. So in a national security context, what regulations or how can we make sure the information that AI is scanning, generating, and giving back to the authorities is actually a proper reflection of what's happening in reality?
Yeah, so that's a pretty big question. It sort of speaks to standard responsible AI policies and procedures and how you think of these things. So in the national security context and other contexts, it's important that if you're going to use an AI system, for example, facial recognition, you need to be able to share documentation for transparency to say, like, hey, this is how the system was coded. It may not work if you deploy it in Cambodia because it was only coded based on information that we obtained in California.
Yeah.
So a lot of this comes from transparency documentation. We know that these models have limitations. And so the best thing that we can do is communicate those limitations effectively so that people can make the best possible decisions on how they are going to use that information, how they're going to check it themselves. And so that's one piece. That's the transparency piece. The other piece, obviously, is building the system for the context it's meant to deploy it in the first place. So if you're going to build a system that's going to do facial recognition in Cambodia or Zaire or wherever, then make sure that you've tested it, or that you've built a system using data that's representative of that population and the context in which it's going to be used. And no data set is perfect, so this is where the transparency comes in. But use the correct data in training these systems, understand its limitations, and communicate those limitations effectively is one way in which we can mitigate much of the risk in these higher risk environments where we are deploying novel technologies in their infancy.
I guess then that also opens up the question of where do you get this data from, and what are the privacy regulations around that? How would you make that distinction between, okay, we're going a bit too far with the amount of data that we collect versus, well, we do need this data critically to make sure that we can inform our AI programs to make sure that they minimize risk and harm?
In surveillance scenarios or scenarios where we're doing facial recognition, there's, like I said, understanding how the model was trained, effectively training the model, and then communicating about how the model was trained so that you can understand the risks in specific contexts. Then there's how the model is actually going to be used. So if you're actually going to deploy this in, say, a stadium, does everybody know that you're using facial recognition on them? And do they know that you're taking their image and then you're using it to retrain the model? These are the types of things that are happening right now in deployments where they're not using best practices for responsible AI.
Yeah.
And it then goes back to this other concept of transparency, where you're deploying it and you're using it in a situation and you're taking data from people and you're using their images in ways that they're not informed about.
Yeah.
So it all comes back to first principles, whether that's in the way you're using the technology or in the way you're developing the technology. And this is where exercising our use of AI ultimately always has to have a principled approach, and you have to ground those principles in the values that you have and the context in which you want to use it.
Yeah. And that's actually a great transition point, because I wanted to talk about your experience a little bit at Microsoft as well, because you have had experience in both public and private. But what would you say is the key differences in the implementation of responsible use of AI? Because in your interview that you had 2 weeks ago, you were talking about how, AI, there's mainly the same problems for both public and for private, of fairness, traceability, human rights, and general safety. But how do those challenges actually play out in the real world between the private industry and government?
So I'll give you an example. I'll give you a couple of examples. Imagine you are in your house and you are an immigrant into this country. You don't speak the language, and the power goes out, and you're worried about medicine that's refrigerated. So you call city services, and an AI voice answers, and you call to report the blackout, and because you're not speaking in English, it responds with instructions for how to recycle plastic. Or imagine you are working your job and your boss calls you into your office and he tells you you're being fired. You ask why you're being fired, and he says it's because you don't cut your hair. And so you call city services and you ask them about whether that's even legal, and the AI voice on the other end of the line says, yeah, it's totally legal, don't worry about it. Or let's say you're a chef and you're in a restaurant and you're looking around for your ingredients because it's the lunch rush, and you see that you can't find the cheese, and then the cheese is gone, and then you go see in the corner of your eye there's a huge rat chewing on the cheese, and you're like, what is the deal with this? So then you call city services and you say, hey, can I still serve this cheese? And the AI voice on the other end says, yeah, of course you can serve the cheese. Just tell the customer that, it's been nibbled on by a rat a little bit. It's just fine. No problem. None of these are actually hypothetical scenarios. This actually happened in New York in 2024 with their AI chatbot. And each of these interactions are real world scenarios that were reported of ways in which the chatbot malfunctioned, including the rat cheese example. Like that really happened.
That's stereotypical New York at that point, rat and cheese.
That really happened. And so I think it kind of speaks to your question of like, how do harms intersect in a specific real world use case where there's a government and they're trying to implement a service. And in this instance, they had this public service chat line. It's the 311 line that you can call in New York. And they trained it on data that was static and it wasn't being updated, as well as transcripts of customer service calls over time that didn't actually reflect the reality of what they wanted the service to implement. And it caused all kinds of problems. And it was immediately shut down in 2024. There was a loss of public trust. And there were real scenarios where people really got hurt. And so this, again, is why when you're deploying these technologies, you need to think about all the scenarios. You need to be engaging with the communities. You need to understand like how someone who is coming to this country and might not speak English might use your system. You need to understand like how a small business owner might use it, or how someone who is looking for legal advice might use it. And that's where this stakeholder engagement piece is critically important, especially in the public service and government environments, because trust is everything in those environments. And unfortunately, in the New York example, that was an example of where they really rushed that rollout and they ran into all kinds of different problems.
Because I was going to also comment on how AI in daily life and how that actually impacts people from on a daily basis, whether that is asking ChatGPT to make you up a recipe or for some life advice or something like that. But how would you say AI policy, especially more, I guess, from a privatization angle, would affect people in their regular lives?
In their daily lives, yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question. So going back to the New York example, right? A big part of my work in Microsoft was we were deploying solutions like the 311 line, or these major chatbots that are like a city would buy, or the government of Brazil would buy. Like these were big custom deployments of AI solutions in high-risk contexts. And for something like the 311 example, if you were to build policy around that, you can tell the chatbot, hey, don't give legal advice.
Yeah.
You're not a lawyer, you know? And so you create these parameters that can prevent harms from the example of where the person got fired and he's asking whether that's legal or not. The chatbot can respond and say, hey, I don't give legal advice. You may want to consult a lawyer or like explore resources to understand employment law in New York more efficiently. So that's where the policy rubber meets the road, is you're understanding the specific harms that can occur in a context like New York or Bangkok or even in Australia. And then you're deploying policies that fit that context and that can make the interactions more meaningful and less harmful in our daily lives.
From a policymaker's perspective, what do you think they're missing the most about AI in a daily in daily life, so to speak? Because there's so many things. It's such a massive program that can be applied to so many different scenarios, that what do you think is the biggest problem that policymakers are missing when it comes to actually going, okay, how do we actually go about implementing this safely and ethically?
Yeah, I think there's probably three quick things I would say about that. Number one, AI is not a regular compliance domain. So there are other compliance domains. There's privacy, there's cybersecurity. What are the main issues with cybersecurity? Well, the spectrum of concern with cybersecurity is, do you think it's important or don't you? Most people think it's important. That's kind of where the argument starts and ends.
Yeah.
Privacy, do you think it's important or don't you? Most people think it is. That's where the argument ends. In responsible AI, it's like you need to think about human rights, you need to think about fairness. Like it's a long laundry list of concerns that are socio-technical and are very complex. So meeting compliance is really not enough for responsible AI. And also, the future driven by AI is something that keeps people up at night. Like privacy is not something that keeps people up at night. I mean, some people, but it doesn't keep my grandma up at night. And I think like those are the people that I think about. I think not to be silly, but like I do think about my grandma and like her use of AI, and like I think about vulnerable populations, right? And so for AI, I think that's one thing to keep for policymakers to consider is like, look, this isn't a regular compliance domain. This is very dynamic, and you need to think about it in dynamic ways. Secondly, no context is the same, and I kind of described this earlier, right? AI built in California is not going to work the same way in Cambodia. So you need to actually talk to the people who are going to use these systems and ask them, how are you going to use it? This is this is what they should have done in New York, right? Like they should have like brought them together and been like, what are you really concerned about with this system? What keeps you up at night? What are the challenges you see? What are the opportunities you're most excited about? And then manage the way you communicate about this system to speak specifically to what people are afraid of and what people are excited about.
Yeah.
That's really, really important. And people miss that. And that is not a part of compliance. That's going even beyond compliance. And then the third thing is there's a very big focus on productivity with AI.
Yes. Especially in the workplace.
Yeah. And then there's this idea of like, am I going to be left behind? And then there's, should I be using this? Should I not be using this? And then how do I feel about it? And obviously, I've talked a lot about like, I think the way we feel about AI is really important. But another thing to keep in mind as it relates to productivity is it is happening regardless.
It's happening whether we like it or not.
Yeah. Yes, this is happening. And there's no really pushing back against it. You can adopt it and you can figure out how to use it and to navigate the risk, or you cannot. And I think, people shouldn't be paralyzed by fear and sort of the way they feel about these things, and instead just find a way to embrace it, because this is the moment we are living in and it's happening regardless of how we feel about it. Yeah. So those are the three things that I think policymakers and people in general should really start to internalize as they think about AI.
Would you say that a concern from at least a policy standpoint as well is how quickly it changes, as in keeping up with all the changes that keep happening, or actually the regulation and rollout of AI?
What I hear most from policymakers is fear of being left behind. And they see municipal governments, for example, they see other municipal rollouts and they're like, oh man, why don't I have that? You know what I mean? Or it's not even just policymakers, it's anyone. They're just, why don't I have this?
Yeah.
And, they want to be on the cutting edge, and they see that this is sort of the future, right? And so they want to move quickly. Everyone wants to move quickly. Like I said, it's a race, right? It's this AI race. But I think you can build a foundation for innovation that's based on trust and based on your specific context and your community, and also move quickly. And by doing that, you can navigate the risk in the most effective way, and in a way that makes people excited and understand in their own context, in their own language, why AI innovation is actually a big opportunity right now.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. What would you say is going to be the biggest issue or problems that you will have to solve in the next 10 years?
Yeah. That's a great question. I love it. I love it.
Because I imagine when, you sat down, started the company being like, so what's it going to look like in the future?
Yeah. So I'll talk about like what we are focused on in particular is what we're calling the procurement and deployment journey. So there are organizations operating in high risk scenarios that might be mining, that might be oil and gas, that might be military applications. We focus a lot on public services, obviously. And there's sort of three things that they're looking at. First, how do I define my own AI needs? How do I even think about like what I need? And if I'm going to actually buy something, how do I buy an AI system that's fit for purpose for my own context? Mm-hmm. And so we help them understand their own needs, and then also define their needs in ways in which they can identify solutions that are going to suit those needs particular. So it's not enough to just buy an AI solution because it looks good. You need to be able to test it and actually prove that it's going to work. And so that's where metrics and evaluations and red teaming is really important. And that needs to happen before you even buy something. Mm. So the second piece then is the governance piece. So now you've bought your AI solution. You are now developing it for your context. How are you engaging with the community that's going to be most affected with it? What are their main concerns? What are your principles for rolling out and deploying this? And then how do you measure the success of those principles as it's being deployed in different scenarios? And so this is where we run these workshops with mixed literacy groups to help understand those challenges and opportunities and build both messaging guidance and principled approaches towards rolling out AI in high-risk scenarios. And then the last piece is the deployment piece. So now you've got your governance. Now you've figured out, you bought your thing. Now you're rolling it out. How do I make sure it's going to be safe over time? And that's actually really important, because you need to be able to do monitoring and evaluation for these solutions, and people will start to use them in novel and new ways. And so you have to create a framework that has feedback loops and that can test these solutions over time, so that you're ensuring that you are speaking both to the concerns that people have, but also meeting those concerns with a principled approach to where that you can also test and validate and meet the compliance for things like the EU AI Act or the U.S. executive order or whichever AI law that you may be subject to.
Yeah, so you're really taking a whole approach to it.
Yeah,
which is great.
Yeah, and what I would say is, I think there are a lot of organizations out there that are taking this compliance, this one size fits all compliance approach, where it's like, just meet the regulation and you're good to go.
Yeah.
And I think they're offering tools which are great. For us, we really want to teach people how to think about these problems so that they can build solutions for themselves.
Yeah.
And my ultimate goal is to work with customers and partners that are able to do this for themselves at the end of the day. They understand it. They've built their own framework. They have their own principles. Now they have the tools to be successful. And that's what I want them to have. I don't want them to need to rely on me to give that to them. I want people around the world to have sustainable solutions for AI.
And I guess the final question that I'll round off, because, I feel like this is a fun question, but from your experience, does AI excite you or scare you, I guess? I have a feeling you're going to lean toward it excites you.
Yeah, I mean...
as long as it's implemented responsibly and there are those, safety checks, those parameters, if AI is used sustainably and responsibly, it could be an exciting new forefront into the future. Or does it scare you to at least some extent?
When I think about AI, I think about the people that I met in Myanmar and Laos and Cambodia and these countries that were so excited.
Yeah.
And they were innovating under incredible constraints. And I think about how this is a technology that could really empower them and give them a voice and give them an ability to make an impact that they wouldn't otherwise have. And I'm really excited about that, while at the same time, I'm kind of afraid that this is a technology that could do the opposite as well. But, I don't live my life based on fear. I live my life based on sort of what I believe. And I think, I believe in these people, and I believe in the impact that we each can have as it relates to this technology. And I'm really excited about having this opportunity to give vulnerable populations more of a voice using technology. And that's what excites me the most about AI.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I could actually talk to you for hours. I would have loved to have probed. I had a whole bunch of other topics I would have loved to have probed you on, but you're a very busy man. Oh. So thank you so much for making time to come all the way to a little radio station at Radio Monash. And good luck with the robotics conference in Perth.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really excited about it. And thank you for all the amazing questions. Such an amazing conversation. I really enjoyed speaking with you.
Amazing. And thank you so much to the US Consulate here in Melbourne for making this opportunity possible. And everybody, thank you so much for listening. And don't forget, you can watch this or listen to this later as well on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on YouTube. Anyway, thank you so much, Max, for joining us. And hopefully till next time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.